How does milk become cheese? What's the process through which milk shifts from being a emulsion to being a polarized, like, two substances? We're going to have on one side cheese or curd, which is cheese, and on the other side whey. So how does that happen? What are the two? There's two processes that we're going to be talking about over and over again in this class.
Acid?
Yeah, so you can add acid, or what's the other way that acids can happen?
Fermentation.
Right, so fermentation is going to be the first term that I'm always looking at for how milk becomes cheese. There are ways to make cheese without fermentation, but for these cheeses we're going to be making, for these rennet curd cheeses, for most cheeses, the first step is going to be fermentation. And specifically in this fermentation, what we're talking about is the fermentation of our lactose, our sugars, will be fermented into lactic acid. There are other acids that will occur, but this is the important one. So this is the magic right here, is that we have the fermentation of the sugars into lactic acid. You detected a little bit of it in the kefir, and if you had the clabber, you would see the same thing. It's slightly sour. There's some lactic acid. There's actually probably quite a bit more than we think. It's just that we can't really perceive it. It takes a long time to train your senses to detect the acid in low doses. But I feel like most people actually can start to detect it when the pH of the milk gets below something like 6. I try not to talk about pH too much because I don't use a pH meter when I make cheese, but it is somewhat important, and I think it's a valid way of measuring acidity in milk. But I want to try to teach you to think about it through the prism of your senses. So this is the main process, fermentation of the sugar, lactose, into lactic acid. What's the, and how is this happening? Like what's the vehicle, or what's the cause of the fermentation?
Bacteria.
Yeah.
Digesting the sugars.
Yeah, exactly. Bacteria, the microbes in the milk, will produce lactic acid. They will do this fermentation. Again, most cheesemakers are adding this as an exterior thing that they're purchasing. They're buying their bacteria as blends. But we don't need to if we have milk that has good, healthy bacteria in it. Yeah, that's what the bacteria are producing. They're turning sugars into acids. And this is true for just about any fermentation involving any lactic fermentation or lactofermentation. Absolutely, which is why the starter culture works. Basically, by creating this acidic environment, the bacteria are creating the environment in which they thrive. Most things can't handle acidity, but these bacteria that we're cultivating, they love acidity. They create it and they thrive in it. So by souring milk, we're actually making it safer to consume. This is one of the things about this class that is so cool, is that we've been taught, at least most of us were taught, to not leave the milk out or it will get sour, right? And that's exactly what I'm telling you to do. Is yeah, leave the milk out. You want it to get sour. By creating a sour milk, hardly any unwanted pathogens can grow in there. First of all, the food source has been taken away, the sugars. There's not much for microbes to eat. And second of all, it's a highly acidic environment, which is inhospitable for most microbes. So then what would be the next step that I'm looking for in how milk becomes cheese? It's souring, and then what?
Coagulation.
Yeah, so that's the second big term that we're going to talk about over and over again. Coagulation simply means the transformation of a liquid into a solid. it's milk, in this case milk, shifting its phase from a liquid into a solid. It's becoming what we're looking for, becoming a gel. The water doesn't get consumed. The water kind of gets locked in to what I call the matrix. What's happening with our starter cultures is that there's just enough acidity that the milk coagulates. It's just kind of a property of milk that once it gets to a low enough, once the pH drops enough, I shouldn't use those terms. Once you have enough acidity, it coagulates. We all know this. If you put lemon juice into milk, you can put a little bit of lemon juice in and nothing happens. But if you put enough in, there's this breaking point where all of a sudden it coagulates because you've changed the acidity to the point where it does this. So that's one way that you get coagulation. The other way, and what we're going to see in our cheeses, is through the addition of rennet. So rennet is a collection of enzymes that will turn milk from a liquid to a solid. It'll even do this with milk that's still sweet. And so there's various types of coagulation, just like there's various types of fermentation. But the one we're going to focus on is rennet coagulation. And these enzymes are coming from, in this case, I always use animal rennet. It's coming from the abomasum, which is the fourth compartment of the ruminant digestive tract. So it's coming from this compartment from a very young milk drinking animal. So these enzymes are extracted from, for this instance, we'll just say calf stomachs. But they have to still be drinking their mother's milk as like their, for me, I say exclusively drinking their mother's milk. Of course, they're gonna be like sampling little plants and eating them, but it's from a very young milk drinking animal, like a month or old or less. 20 to 25 days seems to be the ideal age for the harvesting of an animal for the means of making rennet. So you can get enough rennet to coagulate the amount of milk the animal would drink in its life. So for a lamb, I was told that you can coagulate between 1,000 and 1,500 liters of milk, which is 250 to 300 gallons. And this is what we're going to talk about on day 3, is all about rennet and about the fact that cheese making is a biological process. Humans didn't invent cheese making. It's a part of mammalian life, to drink the milk of our mothers and coagulate it in our stomachs so that we can get the nutrients out of it more efficiently. It needs to be turned to a solid, or else it would pass through without us being able to get the nutrients. Just know that rennet is the main vehicle that we're going to use to get our coagulation. The stomach is a highly acidic environment. So inside the animal stomach, it's highly acid, and then you have the enzymes that do the coagulation. So it's basically the process is happening inside the stomach. It's not like the exact same. It's not like, I don't know that it's technically fermentation. So I think that's enough to look at for now, that we're going to have fermentation, coagulation, and then what would be, let's get one more step and then we'll make cheese. So what would be the third step after coagulation? What did Little Miss Muffet have in her bowl? Yes, and so how do you get curds and whey out of coagulated milk? You have to separate the curds and whey. So basically, once your milk is coagulated, you break it apart. So separation will be our third step. Separation, in this case, I mean cutting. Cutting the curd is a term that you'll hear. And what's happened here is that a lot of these other constituents, the fat, the protein, the minerals, the water, they get trapped in coagulation into this solid matrix. And then when we cut, the fat and the protein and the minerals mainly stay in the curd, and then the whey is a different substance. The whey does have a lot of protein in it, but it doesn't have very much fat if you do things efficiently. Whey is still milk, in my opinion. Whey is just milk with the cheese taken out of it. This is the crux of natural cheese making, is the starter culture that you use. But it also includes other elements, like it could be about the tools that you're using less industrial materials, using raw milk, but not necessarily. There are cheeses that we will make that are not raw, that are not technically pasteurized, but we're gonna heat the milk up to a very high temperature to make our ricotta, and our halloumi will basically be like a boiled cheese. So it's less about raw milk cheese making, although I am an advocate of raw milk, I'm not an extremist about it. It's more about the starter culture that you use and the philosophy behind the fermentation. Where rather than going the route of like, obviously I'm not like sanitizing everything, and we're not trying to like eradicate microbes from the process, we're cultivating them. Usually what I'm going for with my starter cultures is kind of like feeding them and using them to make cheese before they've gotten completely sour. This is the hardest part of this process for people who are new to it, is they tend to go too far. Yeah. They tend to over ferment. And we'll talk about why you don't really want to do that. But just know that in tasting this, know that you're detecting there's still sugars left. And that's important. It means the culture still has the food that it needs. So it's still feeding. Once these cultures run out of sugar, they start going to sleep. It's like the party's over and everyone passes out. And then it becomes a less active starter culture. So to use kefir, or the next one we're going to talk about, clabber, to use them to make cheese, you have to harvest them when it's in this like peak activity. And that's when this is the taste of that peak activity. I started this culture the day I got here, which was 5 days ago, I want to say. I took a jar of fresh milk from that milking, like from the evening milking while it was still warm, and I just left it in the jar without a lid on, just with kind of like a paper towel and then the lid covering it. And it fermented in 24 hours, which usually doesn't happen. This process usually can take up to 3, 4, even 5 days to get this first round of milk to go from a liquid to a solid. And again, what we're seeing is this textural change. So I'll pass this one around, and I want you guys to practice just rocking it to the side and then seeing how far you have to go until it pulls away from the side like that. So just give it a little rock, but don't shake it up. And again, what we're noticing is that it's no longer a liquid, it's gelling, which is another way of saying it's coagulating. And this is what you're always looking for, is to wait until that coagulation occurs. So the jar of raw milk that I just left out, these warm temperatures, in 24 hours it had fermented and soured and turned to a gel. And then what I did was, once that had happened, I took a spoonful of it and put it into a jar of fresh milk. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. This is what I do every day, is I feed the starter culture, just like you'd be feeding a sourdough starter. But you're feeding a very small amount, 1 to 2%. It's the same amount we're going to use when we make cheese. 1 to 2% is all it takes. And at first you won't trust it, and you'll use more than that, which can actually be problematic. It can go too fast, and you can end up going past the desirable fermentation. Yeah, when it's colder and with people's milk that's maybe like doesn't have a lot of good bacteria in it, which is the case for a lot of what I call modern milk that's produced in America. Everyone's encouraged to keep their bacterial counts as low as possible. So even though the milk is raw, there's like not a lot in it, because this is what we've been taught to do to our milk, is to like just eliminate as much as you can the bacteria from it. So I'm going to feed this morning's milk with the grains. And what you're seeing is sweet liquid milk, and I'm just going to put this spoonful in. That's all it's going to take. Tomorrow morning, this will be coagulated. It might even happen tonight, and I might have to put it in the refrigerator. That's probably the case. All right, let's move into clabber. You looked at it. Let's go ahead and do the same thing I did yesterday and shake it up. Tomorrow, remind me and we'll taste this. Like we'll just take a spoonful of it and drink it. But I kind of want to get moving so that we can get our cheese started. So again, I shake it up. And then I'm going to feed it to fresh milk, just like we did with the grains. And normally I would just put a spoonful in because I've done this enough. But I want to actually measure it so you can see how much it would take. And this is a technique that I do when I'm making cheese as well. I do a lot of things by intuition and feel, but I also like to have the numbers. And I think numbers are important and ratios are important. So I use my calculator and I do percentages. And I want to show you how I would do something like that. So I'm going to feed this at a rate of 2%, meaning I'm going to take any given amount of milk and add 2% of its volume as clabber. That was a really confusing way to say that, but this is 400 milliliters of milk, okay? I always use the metric system. Metric system is just superior. So I like these mason jars with the numbers on the sides. 100, 200, 300, 400 I think is about like the lip there, and I think the thing all the way full is 500. So we have 400 milliliters of milk. And then what I want to do in order to get 2% of that is multiply 400 by 0.02. And that will give me 2% of 400. So 400 times 0.02 equals 8. All right, so 8 milliliters is 2% of 400. So I'm going to add 8 milliliters of my already fermented sour milk to this jar of fresh milk. So 8 mils. I also like the these measuring spoons that have both imperial and metric on them. So 1 teaspoon is 5 milliliters. Conveniently enough. So I use, teaspoons, tablespoons, but I'm always using them in terms of the metric equivalent. So 1 teaspoon is 5, and then a half teaspoon is 2.5. So I'll just use these kind of like heaping, because that would be what, 7.5, so I'll just need a little bit more than that. It would basically be like a large spoon, which is how I normally do this. So here's 1 teaspoon. And a half teaspoon. It's a really small amount. It's hard to believe that that's enough, right? And then the rest of this we're going to use to make our cheese today. This is going to be our starter culture. You always want to stir it in though, to get the microbes mixed up. And there's 2 different schools of thought, whether you want the lid on, sealed, or off. For now, I'm going to leave the lid on all the way. By leaving the lid either all the way off or like just covered with a piece of cloth or even cracked, you get some oxygen in there, which will encourage yeast to grow. Yeast requires oxygen, whereas our bacteria, lactic acid bacteria, don't require oxygen. So they are anaerobic, meaning they'll grow with the jar sealed. So let's leave it sealed so you can see that. It's kind of my preferred method, but there is a reason why you might want some yeast in your starter culture. So the starter cultures are fed. Now that they're fed, I want to basically leave them undisturbed, especially as it starts to get close to coagulating. If you shake it up while it's coagulating, you'll lose that nice gel that we saw, and so you won't be able to have that visual observation as much. So I encourage you, when you feed your starter, to put it in like the exact same space and just leave it. And only pick it up when you're going to check it. So when you think it's probably about ready, and you just rock it so that you're not disturbing the coagulation. The coagulation is like this visual cue that the starter is ready. And the first thing we're going to add in order to kickstart the fermentation is the clabber, our starter culture. It could be kefir, it could be a packaged starter culture. It could also be whey from yesterday. If we made cheese yesterday, you can use whey to carry the starter culture forward. But what I won't need to do is figure out how much starter culture to use. And when it's colder, I use 2%. But since it's hot and everything is just flying, meaning the fermentation is going really fast, I'm going to use 1%. So again, what I do is I take the volume of milk, which is 17 liters, okay? Who knows how many milliliters that would be? It's very easy math. This is the beauty of the metric system. 17,000 actually, because a liter is 1,000 milliliters. Which is convenient. So what I'm going to do in order to get 1% in milliliters is I'm going to convert liters into milliliters. So 17,000 milliliters. That's how much milk is in there, 17,000 milliliters. Multiply that by 0.01 to give me 1%. And 1% of 17,000 is 170. I probably didn't need to use the calculator to do that, but I want to show you how you get there. So the starter culture you're just feeding daily, or if you need to take a break, you can leave it in the fridge up to a week and then feed it. But for me, like the best way to maintain these starters is to regularly feed them.
Okay.
And I start new ones everywhere I go. I don't like keep one with me. I'm not the hugest fan of this idea of like proprietary starters. I think that like this is just what milk does.
So that's like ready to go after one feeding. It doesn't need like...
Sometimes it can take multiple rounds. If it didn't smell good, I wouldn't use it. And usually the first round smells a little bit funky.
Oh really? It will kind of improve actually.
Yeah, it gets better with multiple feedings because you're getting more and more of the lactic acid bacteria that we're looking for. It'll have a yogurty, clean smell. This milk, it smelled beautiful in the first round. I don't really know why, but it's a good sign. Like this is also a test of the milk itself. So I have my culture in, and in my normal cheese making process, I would have done that as soon after the milk came out of the animal as possible. Because the sooner you get it in, the better you guarantee that your microbes, the ones that you've been cultivating, are going to start developing, start growing. And there's less space for unwanted things to grow. And so there is a chance that by waiting for these maybe 3 hours now, that something unwanted has gotten in there, but I doubt it. Especially seeing that first round of fermentation made beautiful clabber. It's like, we probably honestly didn't even need to add a starter culture. We probably could have made the cheese without it and it would have fermented beautifully. But I always recommend adding a starter culture because it's kind of you're taking, I don't want to say a crapshoot, but you know what I mean. Like if you don't add a starter culture, it can go in a lot of different directions. So in order to increase the likelihood of a successful fermentation, I recommend always working with a starter culture. Okay, so I stirred in the culture. You see I stirred it like very thoroughly, right? Because you really want to mix all that in and you want to make sure there's no chunks. When I added the culture, I refer to that step as like we're opening this portal. We're like beginning this transformation. And for me, this is a really beautiful and sacred process. So by adding the ferment, we're starting the process of making the cheese. The portal is open and kind of like everything we do is going to be focused on this process. And the next step is to add the rennet. And so what's happening now is that both of those processes that I outlined briefly on the chart are happening simultaneously. The starter culture is beginning to grow. It's multiplying. It's starting to consume the lactose. And the coagulation is happening. The coagulation is happening due to a shift in the proteins. The rennet, the enzymes that we add, are like altering the structure of those proteins, and it causes this crazy chain reaction where the milk goes from being an emulsion where everything's diffused to like separating apart. This is our established starter that I've been feeding multiple times. And the other thing we're going to do today is start a new one so that you can see what it looks like as it develops. So this was yesterday morning. We had fresh milk. We just put the spoonful of grains straight into it. And so I always shake it up as good as I can before I strain. And then rather than measure out the amount that I'm going to feed, I'm just going to show you what I normally do, which is simply taking a spoon and dropping it in. For the small jar, it only needs to be, I think, about less than 5 milliliters. So I'll just do, again, I'm gonna shake it up, and you can see that texture in there. It's like a lump of coagulated milk. And I'll just drop like a full spoonful into the big jar and about a half a spoonful into the smaller jar. That's all it's going to take. And then we have this left as our starter for making today's cheese.